Okay, so I've just introduced Gramsci's concept of hegemony and how important the kind of difference it is from the classic Marxist concept of ideology, and now how important this idea of consent is. And consent in general, and kind of this sort of thought, is really passive consent. We don't wake up every day and say, yeah, we consent to the nature of reality. And that's what's so powerful for us, is that we give basically kind of a unintentional subconscious consent to the structure of the world, thinking it is as it always has been, or it is as it has to be. So Gramsci, but in order for this idea of hegemony to really make sense, Gramsci actually has to rework the kind of the Marxist set of ideas a little bit. So there's some important shifts he makes. So first he introduces this idea of consent, and then he introduces kind of a real complexity to the nature of economic and social relations. So whereas in maybe classic Marxist interpretations, they would look for kind of clear class groupings that have clear ways of having power over society, Gramsci would look and say that actually conditions are shifting all the time, and that even if we call something the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, could in itself be very complex. It could be very divided, have all sorts of fractures in it. And I have a good example of this for you. In the lead up to the healthcare reform package that was passed a couple of years ago and introduced by the Obama administration, there are all sorts of fractures amongst the owners of various types of aspects of healthcare in the United States. So the pharmaceutical companies were okay with health reform as long as they had a certain deal. The doctors, American Medical Association, was originally opposed, but then endorsed the idea. You had financial corporations involved, you had healthcare institutions involved, and all of these interests, they're all, in a classic Marxist sense, part of free market capitalist structure, but they had different interests and what they wanted out of this legislation, and sometimes their interests were opposed with each other. And Gramsci at his best could kind of analyze the complexity of, for example, his own country, Italy, in this way, to kind of look at all the various fissures and fractures that were going on. So then he, not only does he see a complexity in what we would normally in a Marxist sense call the base, he also sees a complexity in the superstructure, in culture. He sees clearly a connection between cultural ideas and institutions and the base, but he also sees that culture is somewhat autonomous, and that's an important word. I'll put that right here, autonomous, which means that what goes on in cultural life, ideas, beliefs, institutions, isn't completely determined by the base. That there's a level of freedom or flexibility by you and I or other people that produce cultures, your minister, a musician, things like that, to actually kind of be thinking things and saying things that aren't completely economic in nature. But for Gramsci, what's important is that even this autonomy of culture still was kind of within the mysticism of ideology, and it was actually through these various forces that appear to be kind of free of ideology that hegemony really works, because these other forces actually make the world as we see it and the relations of the world seem natural. So what Gramsci said is that in hegemony there's a huge role for common sense, and what he means by that is that our worlds are really peppered and filled with and held together by common sense beliefs about the way the world works and the nature of the world. And that instead of just this ideology system plopped on down, instead there are all sorts of common sense beliefs that were a part of cultural institutions and cultural ideas that filter down to people. And it's these beliefs that drive the way we relate to the world and what we see as possible or what we see as legitimate in the world. And these common sense beliefs are really powerful because they feel so commonsensical. They feel so natural. It's not as if it's some dictate or message from on high by a dictator who has crazy messages. No, instead what Gramsci says, this is the nefarious part of hegemony, is that the ideological notions of the whole cultural system actually are fully accepted by us as common sense beliefs. So as I mentioned before, in Gramsci's sense, culture isn't just about kind of big institutions that Marx pointed to, like law. Instead, Gramsci likes to look at what you might call, or what we can call, civil society institutions. So Gramsci was really enthralled actually with the Roman Catholic Church, or if you know anything about modern Catholicism, was quite powerful in Italy, especially in the early part of the 20th century. And one reason why Gramsci was enthralled by institutions like the Catholic Church is he saw that so many people had a loyalty to its beliefs, its practices, to providing money in their local church, to going regularly on Sunday, and to feeling like the church had an authority over what they did with their lives. And it was through these kind of local, autonomous cultural spaces that hegemony really worked, that the world really took on a commonsensical nature, and that people really gave consent to things. And a key set of people that were involved in this process for Gramsci are what he called in a classic phrase, let me write this down, organic intellectuals. And so Gramsci would say, look, you don't have to look to the big flashy intellectuals that everybody knows in Italian society to understand how hegemony works. Instead, you can look to all the professionals out there, the parish priests, the doctors, the local lawyer, the local town representative. Look to all of them, and all of them, through their leadership in civil society institutions, they're all the ones that regenerate these common sense beliefs from day to day, year to year, and from generation to generation. They're passed through these institutions that aren't necessarily directly related to economic conditions and economic forces, but are the ones that kind of keep reproducing this hegemonic power of ideology that I've been talking about. So he actually looked at these organizations and realized that the nefarious aspect of culture in this case is that it was kind of everywhere, all the time, being reproduced as parts of people's life all the time. And what he realized was that this is actually the single most powerful way to keep a society together and keep a set of economic relations like capitalism in place, because, and this is a key point, it doesn't require violence. People have willingly given their consent to this whole system of thinking without knowing that they're giving their consent, and therefore violence isn't needed to keep people in line, to keep people behaving as a part of the system as it already exists. And as a matter of fact, Gramsci said, when violence occurs, so when especially like the state uses violence to break strikes or to break protest or to enforce laws, he said that actually is problematic for the state, because it's revealing this whole system, this hegemonic system that I've been talking about. It reveals that it exists, because it makes people kind of wake up to say like, whoa, wait a second. What is at play here, or what's the big deal that such violent physical use of force is needed to enforce something? So at all costs, according to Gramsci, a government would avoid violence because it would really expose the hegemonic system that was in place for people. A good way to think about this is, for example, in the violence that's occurring in Syria now. Now, there's always been a secret police apparatus in Syria for decades, but the fact that it's the tension has degenerated into violence there actually kind of throws up into bright lights the extent of the state apparatus there, and just how and the importance of the dominant political and economic system that the state apparatus is trying to defend, and to the lengths that it will go to defend that, literally killing civilians, women and children, particularly in the city of Homs in Syria. So you get a sense of what Gramsci is talking about actually applies to things that we actually see around us today. So let me say a few things about what Gramsci has done in terms of making Marx's theory easier to work with. So he sees not only the base driving the superstructure, but he sees that the superstructure actually allows the base to continue existing through this hegemony in which we give consent to common sense beliefs about that the way the world is working is the way the world should work. That actually keeps the base going. So he actually helps to revise Marx's theory on that. He sees the complexity, that there's complexity in both the base as well as there's complexity in culture. And in particular, he looks to these civil society organizations and their leadership by organic intellectuals to show how the hegemonic power of culture happens especially on the local level. He shows us how deep ideology can be within individual members of society. And, this is interesting, he basically shows a potential way out of all these problems, which is that if you can get organic intellectuals to see the world differently, to actually begin to question the nature of power and politics and economics, then you can actually start to change people's consciousness, and then you can especially start to have political and economic reform. So he's actually kind of giving a different recipe than Marx. Marx would say kind of change the base and you'll produce a socialist revolution, and Gramsci's saying instead change the ideology, reveal the ideology, break the hegemony, allow people to actually see reality as it is, and then they'll be able and willing to try and change politics and economics. Let me give you a quick example before I end this part of the lecture. Here's a common sense idea that you often hear, that corporations are people too, and that corporations are good for the local community. Well, is that the case? There's, without a doubt, corporations are important to communities for the jobs they provide and things like that. But there's also lots of things that corporations do that aren't necessarily good for the communities that get kind of covered over. So, for example, they support, often give lots of money to local fundraisers and local organizations as donations, right? Well, that's one way of kind of keeping civil society in check, keeping organic intellectuals dedicated to keeping the dominant economic and political system going. Corporations do a lot of greenwashing nowadays, where they call all of their products green. They call an automobile green, despite the fact that it still uses gas and uses lots of natural materials. They often will seek to get special concessions from local governments so they don't have to pay local taxes, which are important to local governments. So you can see where common sense ideas, maybe knee-jerk ideas that a lot of us have as participants in the nature of the American economy, when you start to scratch at it, you realize that they can be, they're part of kind of a hegemonic system of the way we look at the world. And you start to see how some of Gramsci's ideas can make quite a bit of sense. So I'll stop there and I'll come back with the next main topic in the lecture.